Welcome to the second in a series of short guidance videos on using the Carbon Footprint and Project Register tool. The tool has been developed by the Sustainable Scotland Network team at Keep Scotland Beautiful, Resource Efficient Scotland and partners to support the public sector to implement effective carbon management processes. The tool will help you in calculating your annual and future carbon footprint, as well as collating and managing your very own project register. It is hoped that in using this tool correctly, public bodies will find it easier to complete Section 3 of the Public Bodies Duties Climate Change Reporting Form. This video will focus on carbon footprinting and how you can use the tool to complete your organisation's current and future year's footprint. It will also help to explain how to define your own emissions factors and costs, as well as provide a brief overview of how the tool uses the data you provide it to generate a host of different outputs, particularly those to assist with completing your public body's climate change duties report. Before you begin using the tool and inputting data, you want to first make sure that you are working to the correct reporting year type. The reporting year of your organisation will dictate what emission factors will be applied to your energy sources, so it is crucial that you ensure that this is correct before continuing. The options available are financial year, calendar year, and academic year. For an academic year reporting year type, these will use slightly different emissions factors, so it is very important that you make sure that this setting is correctly applied before continuing. The reporting year type can be set on the Historic CFs tab shown here and cell B6. Like so. Also in this tab, you have the opportunity to enter historic emissions and historic costs from previous versions of the tool, or from other historic datasets that your organisation may keep. There are three tables here which you can populate. Table 1 is for historic emissions, split by either stationary, waste, or transport sources. Table 2 is for historic costs, split by these same sources. And finally, Table 3 is for historic emissions, split by scopes 1, 2 and 3. The tool allows you to both enter historic emissions and historic costs, split by either source or scope. Or, if you do not have this breakdown, you may simply enter total cost or total emissions. And we'll now demonstrate how this works. So that was an example of me entering emissions split by scope. However, if I did not have this breakdown, I could simply override the formula and go straight to the total. Like so. Once you have finished entering your historic costs and historic emissions, you may begin compiling your current year footprint. This is to be done on the Current and Future CFs tab shown here. I will talk you through a few examples here so you can see how this works within the tool. In row 7 we have an example of a natural gas emission source. The first 5 columns of this table are to allow you to enter as much or as little information as you like to help you and colleagues understand exactly what this emission source is and where it arises from. In this example, we have natural gas emissions from a general office which we are calling Building 1. The next 2 columns are very important. They are coloured brown, which, referring to our colour scheme, tells us that we must enter information in these columns to allow the tool to complete its calculations. Should we leave these cells blank here, you will encounter issues in using the tool. Column G asks if this emission source is an existing one, so we have selected yes. Because it is an existing source, Column H by default should be left as NA. However, if this was a future emission source, we would select No in column G as shown, and then in column H we would select the year that the emission source would come into effect. However, more on that later. The tool then asks more voluntary questions on things such as floor area and whether or not the source is subject to the carbon reduction commitment scheme. Should you not know this, please simply leave blank or select No. And finally, you are asked to select the type of emission source for which gas is stationary, the emission type, which is natural gas, the scope, which in our example is scope 1, and finally the amount or consumption, which we have given as 5 million. Please note the units of consumption or amount must align with column L. This tells us that we need to enter consumption in kilowatt hours. This is all the information the tool needs to then calculate current carbon emissions and current costs for this natural gas emission source. And as you can see, it has calculated the carbon emissions from this emission source to be 920 tonnes of CO2 equivalent at a cost of £98,218. I will now talk you through an example of entering both an electricity emission source and a water emission source. We are going to set the emission source also in building 1, which we know is a general office in our example. We know that this is an existing building operation, so we will select Yes here, and in which case this column must only be set to NA. Our emission source is not subject to the CRC scheme, so we select No here. And we know the floor area from before is 2,000 metres squared. Electricity is a stationary source, so we select stationary. And we know the emission type is grid electricity. Now the scope works a little bit differently here to most reporting processes. Generally, electricity should be defined as scope 2, with its T&D losses to be defined as scope 3. However, this tool deals with the generation and losses together, so for scope for electricity, always select the last option, which is scope 2 and 3. Column A, shown here, also has a prompt to let you know that this is the case. Please note what happens when I select scope 1 here. There is a prompt there to say, for electricity sources, please ensure scope is set to 2 and 3. So setting it to 2 and 3, and the prompt disappears. For the amount, we know from column L that the emission consumption type should be in kilowatt hours. So we're going to ensure that we enter our information in kilowatt hours, and we're going to say 3 million kilowatt hours of electricity. And the tool is able to calculate the carbon footprint in tonnes of CO2 and the cost associated to that emission source. For water, we must enter water supply and water treatment as separate rows. We are going to say that this water source is also in building 1, which we know is a general office. We know that this is an existing building, as before. So column H is NA. We know that the floor area for this building is 2,000 meters squared, sorry. and that water emission sources are not subject to the CRC. The type of source is also stationary. All water sources should be defined as stationary sources. And for water supply, the emission type is simply water supply. And for water treatment, the source is simply water treatment. Please note also in column A there is a prompt here so that when you select a water supply source, or when you enter a water supply source, it also prompts you to not forget to add in the water treatment source too. This should be assumed to be 95% of supply consumption, which we will come to in just a second. Water emission sources must always be scope 3, so we select scope 3 for both of them. And I'm going to say that the consumption or amount is 100,000 meters cubed, which we can see is the units in column L. For water treatment, as it says in here, column A, we want to select 95% of our water supply consumption. And just like that, the tool has calculated the carbon emissions from water treatment to be 34 tonnes of CO2, and from water treatment 67 tonnes of CO2, and equivalent costs for both sources in column P. Should you run out of rows within this table, please use the macro button at the top of the page to enter additional rows. You may also use the drop-down box in cell D3, shown here, if you want to add several rows at once. So for example, if I wanted to add in 3 additional emission sources, I would select 3 here, click the macro button, wait a few seconds, and 3 new emission source rows will have been added, just like that. This is to allow you to enter additional emission sources such as waste sources or transport sources, which data can be entered in exactly the same way as natural gas, electricity and water supply, given you have the correct data. All emissions factors can be viewed on the Emissions Factors tab shown here. Factors are split into 4 tables. We have our stationary or fuel sources, our waste sources, our transport or travel sources, and finally our renewable sources. Should you wish to define your own emissions factor, the tool also allows you to do this. For example, say you wish to define an emissions factor or emission source for red oil. You can define it as follows. Simply name the source, which we will call red oil, in one of the user-defined rows. Then select the units you wish to apply for the emissions factor, which we will say kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour, and define what the emissions factor is. In this case we will just say it's 0.2 kilograms of CO2 per kilowatt hour, and we will also assume that this is going to be flat projection over time. Please note the prompt in selecting one of these user-defined cells. It reminds you to not forget that since you are defining a new emissions factor, you must also assign a cost. This can be done in the Costs tab here. You will see that your emissions factor for red oil and units has already been picked up by the tool, and therefore all you need to do is apply your cost in pounds per kilowatt hour for this emission source, which again we will just use an arbitrary number and assume it is flat over time. Obviously when you were doing this you would know what the emissions factor and cost factor was for the emission source that you were defining. What you will then notice is when you go back to the current and future CFs tab and select a stationary source, you will see that red oil is now an option for you to select in the drop-down list. So far we have only discussed current year carbon footprinting. The tool can also deal with future year emissions. I refer you now to columns Q, R and S of the current and future CFs tab. It is in these three columns that you can use the tool to forecast emissions out several years into the future. Column Q asks you for the year of change of the emission source, i.e. what year, if any, will this emission source begin to change. Column R asks for what level of change, if any, is expected. And finally, column S asks when is the final year that this emission source is in operation. So for example, we have already defined our electricity emissions for building 1 within this video. Let's say that we now know in 2017/18 consumption of electricity is going to halve due to a reduction of staff numbers. And we also know that in the year 2019/20 the building is going to completely shut. So in column Q we will select the year of change to be 2017/18, and the year of change in that year will be -50%. And we also know that the building is going to close in the year 2019/20, so the final year of full operation will be the year before that, which is 2018/19. And what you can see is that next year the amount or consumption has halved from 3 million to 1.5 million kilowatt hours, and emissions and costs have been worked out accordingly. And in 2019/20 there is no amount, no emissions and no costs, because we have told the tool that by that point the emission source will cease to exist. If you are not aware of any other changes to your estate, simply select NA for all of these columns. Since these columns are headed brown, they must be completed for the tool to correctly work. As a further prompt, columns T onward will also warn you of this. So we must fill in all these cells before continuing. Now we have given the tool some data, it is time to have a quick overview of what outputs it has generated. This Output tab has a whole host of charts and tables that you can pull out for your own reports should you wish to. There is also a handy list at the top of the tab shown here, which allows you to hyperlink straight to the section of this tab with the output you would like to view. And you can return back to the top by clicking these hyperlinks. Additionally, to further assist with completing Section 3 of your Public Bodies Climate Change Duties Report, we have added in a specific tab which collects data in a way that can be easily transposed over to questions 3A, 3B and 3C of the online Climate Change Report template. 3A is for historic and current year emissions split by scope, taken from the Historic CFs tab, as well as the information we provided in the current and future year CFs tab for 2016-17. Three B collates all emission sources from the current year based on information provided in the current and future CFs tab. Please note that this is where grid electricity is split out into its generation row and its transmission and distribution losses row. And finally, if you have entered renewables into your footprint, these will appear in 3C. Both output tabs do not require any additional information on your part. They simply pull through the data that we've already provided the tool in an easy to manage form.